After years of growth, Latin America has arrived at a crossroads. Growth rates have stalled, leaving much of the region in a recession. The commodities boom, once the engine behind a significant rise in employment, salaries and lower poverty levels, is all but over. And with lower oil prices and other economic forces at work, the social gains of the last decade are at risk, and political discontent is on the rise. Later, we'll talk with several experts about the challenges facing the region, but we begin with this report from CCTV's Joel Richards in Buenos Aires.
At evening school, Laura Tapia is studying to complete her secondary education. She would like to be an art teacher one day, but with no formal education, she's unable to find regular work of any kind.
I get by with money from odd jobs, but with my daughter and the hours I do work, it's chaos. I always used to get by just fine. I rent a place, but now I have to be like David Copperfield.
Joking is one way Laura copes with her concerns about life, both now and in the future.
There is no way around it. You have to be tough.
Economic policies put in place under Argentine President Mauricio Macri are proving painful in neighborhoods like this and across the country. Funding for this education program is under review. Prices are rising and work is scarce. A recent report by the Catholic-run Social Debt Observatory found that an additional 1 million people fell into poverty in the last 3 months alone.
Now it is winter, it is cold. The gas bill is 4, 5 or 6 times more expensive, and wages that don't increase because of economic activity has dropped, which makes wage negotiations much more complex.
Tough economic times are underway across Latin America. In Argentina, most analysts expect annual inflation to top 40%. Brazil, the region's largest economy, is facing its worst recession since the 1930s. In Venezuela, the economy is hamstrung by energy cuts, shortages and inflation. And Colombia, once among the top economic performers, has seen its slowest growth in 7 years. This panorama is prompting a political shift in Latin America. For over a decade, Latin America has been known for the so-called pink tide, a wave of left-leaning governments that place the focus on policies that aim to redistribute income across the poorer sectors. But analysts say these benefit programs did not tackle poverty's root causes and ultimately created a backlash that gave rise to conservative movements and victory for centre-right candidate Mauricio Macri in Argentina.
In Latin America, political processes have always been linked to each other as a domino effect, from the populist governments in the 1940s and 1950s, the dictatorships in the 1970s, more recently the progressive governments, now conservative parties that are successful.
In the face of austerity measures in Argentina, there is concern the recession may return to the crisis levels of the late 1990s. That's when this social cooperative began. Amongst those studying with their children at evening class are some of the cooperative's founders.
It has never been easy in this country. It's not that before we were better off. We have never been well off. We have always had to fight. My children didn't finish secondary school. They had to go out and work.
On the walls outside, a clear reminder of the crisis of 2001 in Argentina and the social challenges facing this country and this region. Joel Richards, CCTV, Buenos Aires.
Joining us here in Washington is Eric Farnsworth. He's Vice President of the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas. With us from Boston is Julio Ricardo Varela. He's Digital Media Director and Political Editor at Futuro Media Group. Also joining us is Isaac Cohen. During his 24-year tenure with the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean region, he served as the group's director here in Washington. And joining us once again from Sao Paulo, Brazil, is the chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Charles Tang. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Charles, in Sao Paulo, let me start with you. China's direct non-financial investment in Latin America went up something like 67% from 2014 to 2015, and that came at a time when overall overseas investment in Latin America dropped by 9%. So what is China seeing in the region that many other countries are not seeing?
Well, I think that China, in the case of Brazil, China is seeing great opportunities at very, very low prices because of the political turmoil and the economic slowdown. In the rest of Latin America, the whole continent and the whole region is benefiting very much from the trade and the much needed investments in infrastructure that the whole region needs. And I think that China is investing in the region just as they do in the whole world, because they would like to occupy part of the market. In the case of Brazil and other countries here, they need access to the sources of the strategic resources that China needs for its continued growth, sustained growth, and for the food security of its people. And also, in terms of geopolitical terms, I wrote an article for the World Policy Institute of New York where I alluded to the fact that the backyard of America is growing a Chinese garden because of this trade and much needed investments. At a time where the U.S. is withdrawing, China is entering in a very big way and creating alliances, economic alliances, with most of the nations and practically all the nations of the whole region.
Isaac, I'm wondering how much all of this is going to help the region. The United Nations Development Program tells us that up to 30 million people in Latin America risk falling back into poverty. What's causing that?
Well, it's slower growth because the commodities that Latin America exports, its prices have been coming down drastically. And one of the reasons is because demand in China has gone down. And you see stellar economies like Chile, for instance, experiencing difficulties because of the fact that China is not getting as much copper as it used to. And several other metals, minerals, even agricultural products have gone down because of the fact that demand in China has gone down.
Eric, I'm wondering, these ambitious plans that China has, how does it square with the fact that in many instances these countries in Latin America are commodity exporting countries, raw materials are exported from these countries, those prices have fallen and demand has fallen as well?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the things that a number of us observers have been saying about particularly South America for a long time is that an over-reliance on commodities at some point is going to come back and be a problem for you economically, because the commodities cycles are cyclical by definition. And we're in the downward side of that. There are opportunities for investment. There are opportunities to buy in at the low end of the cycle for the longer term perspective investor, and I think that's very positive. But one of the things that we didn't see over the last 10 years or so is the fundamental reforms that should have been taken across the region because there was no political incentive to do so. There was a lot of money coming in. Things were very good. The political leadership was being rewarded for the decisions it was or wasn't making. There was no incentive to make those reforms. Now, when those reforms would be providing the path to growth that the region is looking for, they haven't been made. So in some ways, the region has to play catch up. And whether it's infrastructure, as we've already discussed, or other issues like tax policy, education policy, all the things we've talked about so many times on this show, these are issues where there is going to be a need for attention.
Right, so Eric, when you talk about these reforms and talk about things like development of infrastructure, also reform of tax policy in these countries. Have these countries also failed to diversify their economy sufficiently?
I think that's precisely the point. Diversification is a key element that needs to be undertaken, but it's hard to do. I mean, it's easy for people like me to say you need to diversify. It's very difficult to do, and it requires a confluence of a lot of things, innovation policy as well, and issues to really create an entrepreneurial class to start businesses and continue along that line. There's a lot that's going on here that I think the region faces.
Let's look at some specific countries. Let's go to Julio for this. Julio, if we look at China's relationship with Cuba, it's a good relationship. Trade and economic relations with Cuba grew by something like 57% in the first 3 quarters of 2015 to 1.6 billion. But now we have Cuba, which is normalizing its relationship with the United States. How is that going to impact a country like China and its relationship with Cuba?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think all the chips on U.S. policy right now when it comes to Latin America are in Havana. And it's pretty clear that the Obama administration is trying to use sort of U.S. influence to help transform Cuba into becoming more of a consumer capitalistic society. And it seems to be like that's the only policy that's coming out of Washington, D.C. these days when you're talking about Latin America. And there are questions about whether the United States is kind of late to the Cuban party, because this has been going on for a couple of decades now. But I do think that the U.S., the appetite to look into the market of Cuba is coming in with new capital and new cash. And considering the fact that there's very, very strong ties between Cuba and the United States that has been going on for centuries, that the United States is going to be a player, and a pretty dominant player in Cuba. And we might be seeing, the start of a different type of Cuba that might lead to tension with other countries in terms of trade. So I think there's going to be a lot of competition in Cuba now that the United States is definitely going to get involved. And, the train has left the station. And I actually see the United States becoming more and more economically more and more tied to Cuba than ever before.
Charles, I want to get to a point that Eric raised, and that is, the fact that we've seen unprecedented growth between Latin America and China, but that growth has been largely based on the export of raw materials to China at a time when, China had a huge demand. And now that prices are dropping, now that demand is dropping, how do you see China's relationship with Latin America economically evolving?
I think that there are the plans that have been announced. They're talking about profound structural changes, and I think that these structural changes will be very, very necessary in order to have Brazil grow again. And Brazil will grow again once these policies are implemented, because Brazil is a very wealthy country. And once you are lowering the costs, the Brazil costs, which is basically what they're trying to tackle, I think that we will see a great difference, and Brazil will start to grow again. And I believe that Brazil also needs a very strong industrial policy, so that the Brazilian industrialists are not competing in the world with a hand tied behind them because of the Brazil cost, which is very high.
Isaac, there are great plans that have been put in place. I mean, there's this great railway project which they want to build. China is building in Brazil, from connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. In reality, is that going to happen? What's the status of a project like that?
Well, I think there are several infrastructure projects where China has been involved decisively that are coming to fruition right now. You see, for instance, hydroelectric dams in Ecuador that are going to transform generation of power in Ecuador decisively towards renewables. That's an example. The example of the railway, transcontinental rail, that will be considerable too. I think that the point was made that China has been investing in trying to improve the sources of the raw materials that it has been demanding. But the question now, and I think this is decisive, is if the new model that is emerging in China gives the same kind of strategic role to the imports of commodities as we knew. I think that that's not the case. And let me give you an example. For instance, I wish China, and particularly young people in China, would drink more coffee. That would make a big difference. Now, for instance, Chile, instead of copper, what they're doing is they're exporting fruit, wines, and not raw commodities, but processed food, particularly.
So this fits in with China's transition to what, a more consumer-driven economy?
Exactly. Yeah. If the new model involves the demand for equivalent products, as the ones we saw before, not only raw materials, because Latin America, I think, is interested in exporting processed raw materials. That would be very interesting, if some degree of processing would take place in the region and then exported. China can be a part of that too. But to me, there is a new source of demand that we need to discover still to see if China is going to be playing the decisive role it was playing before.